January 17, 1945. A small village in western Germany lies beneath a fragile blanket of snow. The rooftops glint in the pale morning light, smoke curling from chimneys, carrying the scent of burning wood and stale bread. Silence dominates, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery echoing across the fields. Inside modest homes, German women soldiers cling to their rifles, eyes wide with fear, hearts pounding with every distant crack of gunfire. They had been told the Americans were ruthless, that no village would be spared. Through frost-covered windows, they catch fleeting glimpses of movement, a column of vehicles advancing along the main road. Shouts in English carry over the crisp air, sharp and unfamiliar. Hands tighten around triggers. They expect chaos. They expect blood. Yet, something is different this time. No shells explode. No machine guns roar. The Americans approach with deliberate calm, their figures almost serene against the winter landscape. The women hold their breath, torn between the instinct to flee and the fear of defiance. For the first time in months, the notion that the enemy might act with restraint enters their minds, a realization that will shake them more than any gunfire ever could. The column edges closer, and the moment of truth is about to arrive. By late 1944, the tide of World War II had turned decisively against Germany. On the Western Front, Allied forces advanced relentlessly, pushing through the shattered remnants of the Siegfried Line. American, British, and Canadian units moved with coordination and precision, leveraging superior numbers, air support, and logistical strength. In contrast, the German army was increasingly fractured. Veteran divisions were depleted, younger and less experienced recruits were pressed into service, and the war effort demanded every available civilian, including women, to support both defensive operations and essential military roles. In the villages scattered across Western Germany, life had grown tense and unpredictable. Civilians and auxiliary soldiers alike lived under constant threat. Propaganda painted the approaching Allies as invincible and merciless, while whispered rumors from returning soldiers painted a grimmer picture of villages burned and homes razed. German women, conscripted into auxiliary military service, found themselves manning anti-aircraft positions, transporting supplies, and, in some cases, receiving basic training in infantry defense. They understood the danger all too well. The Americans were coming, and they were expected to fight, surrender, or die. The village in question, nestled among low hills and forested terrain, was strategically insignificant, yet symbolically critical to local morale. Roads leading into the settlement had been mined, barricades erected, and defensive positions dug hastily along the outskirts. German officers briefed their units on every conceivable contingency: ambushes, snipers, and potential artillery fire. Every sound in the distance, an engine, a footstep, a crack of distant gunfire, was a signal of imminent danger. Outside the village, the American advance was deliberate and calculated. Task forces moved in armored columns, supported by infantry and engineers, their objective clear: occupy territory efficiently while minimizing civilian casualties. Intelligence reports highlighted that morale in German villages was low and that civilians and auxiliaries were already frightened, weary, and disillusioned. This knowledge shaped American tactics. Reconnaissance units tested defenses, while officers instructed soldiers to avoid unnecessary confrontation. Their approach would not rely on overwhelming firepower, but on calculated restraint, a stark contrast to the violence the German women anticipated. In this frozen landscape, the psychological state of the German women soldiers was complex. They were trained enough to know the destructive potential of American weapons: M4 Sherman tanks, M1 Garand rifles, and artillery capable of leveling entire streets. Yet their understanding of Allied discipline and restraint was limited. Propaganda and rumor had filled their imaginations with scenes of carnage. Fear was omnipresent, and the sight of approaching vehicles triggered automatic defensive reactions. Many of these women had never fired a shot in anger, Yet their hands gripped weapons with trembling intensity, minds oscillating between duty and terror. At the same time, the broader context of war shaped every decision on both sides. Germany was facing severe shortages of fuel, ammunition, and food. Military communications were unreliable, and units were isolated. On the Allied side, logistics and coordination were at a peak. Engineers cleared mines, medics followed close behind, and command structures ensured that occupation forces could advance without unnecessary engagement. This imbalance between German uncertainty and American precision would set the stage for an encounter that would defy expectations, leaving the German women unprepared for the methodical calm of the American liberators. In the village streets, small details revealed the tension of daily survival. Wooden shutters were bolted, doors reinforced, and families gathered in cramped cellars. Fires burned low to conserve fuel. Animals, often kept for food, moved nervously. Each sound, each shadow, carried the potential for catastrophe. The women soldiers, a mix of youth and experience, patrolled the narrow lanes with alert eyes. Their fear was not just for themselves, but for the civilians who looked to them for protection. The stage was set. A quiet village, a population bracing for the worst, and an approaching army whose actions would rewrite every expectation. The next moments would not only test the nerves of these women soldiers, but also reveal an unexpected facet of warfare. Restraint as a weapon as potent as any artillery shell, WWII late 1944. German women were no longer merely civilians caught in the crossfire. They had become active participants in the war effort. Many served in the Luftwaffe's anti-aircraft units, manning flak guns to defend cities and villages from Allied bombers. Others were assigned to the Wehrmacht as auxiliaries, driving trucks, maintaining communications, or assisting in supply logistics. A smaller number even received basic training in infantry tactics, primarily for home defense, though combat experience was rare. This dual role, civilian and soldier, placed them in constant psychological tension. They carried weapons not out of desire, but necessity, and often faced fear far exceeding their formal training. In small villages on the western edge of the Reich, these women soldiers became the first line of observation. They monitored roads, reported suspicious movements, and maintained a fragile sense of order among panicked civilians. Their understanding of the approaching American forces was filtered through years of propaganda and fragmented intelligence. Radio broadcasts painted the Allies as overwhelmingly powerful and merciless, and stories from retreating German units only reinforced this image. Fear was reinforced by real experiences. Neighboring towns had been shelled or bombed during the Allied push across France and Belgium. Yet, this fear coexisted with an acute awareness of vulnerability. Resources were scarce, ammunition limited, and German military command increasingly distant. Many of the women understood that direct combat with American units could be suicidal. They observed American bombing campaigns, armored advances, and coordinated infantry assault from afar and knew the Americans possessed technological superiority. Sherman tanks could easily crush defenses, M1 Garand rifles outranged their own small arms, and mechanized units moved with speed the German defenders could rarely match. This combination of fear and tactical realism shaped their expectations. When scouts reported approaching forces, these women soldiers prepared for the worst. Streets were barricaded, improvised trenches dug, and weapons checked and rechecked. Their anticipation was intense. Even the most inexperienced auxiliary knew that a misstep could lead to death or capture. Yet, beneath this readiness was a pervasive sense of disbelief. Could an army advance without firing? Could they, the defenders, face the enemy and survive unscathed? Such thoughts seemed almost impossible, shaped as they were by propaganda and prior encounters. Meanwhile, American forces advancing toward the village approached with careful deliberation. Intelligence officers had studied local maps, identified the locations of potential ambushes, and instructed their troops on minimizing civilian harm. Their strategy relied on speed, communication, and psychological control, overwhelming presence without initiating violence. This method, calculated and precise, contrasted sharply with German expectations of chaotic and destructive warfare. The Americans' reputation for tactical efficiency, combined with restraint, created a scenario that would bewilder any defender accustomed to the brutal reality of the front lines. The tension in the village built incrementally, amplified by small, almost imperceptible cues. The sound of engine hums, the gleam of vehicle metal in the early light, the faint rhythm of marching boots. Each sensory detail heightened the sense of anticipation. German women soldiers alternated between moments of steely focus and quiet panic, constantly aware of the fragile boundary between life and death in their snow-covered village. As dawn progressed, the stage for the encounter was fully set. The women were armed, vigilant, and ready for combat. The village was prepared for a siege, and yet the Americans approached with calculated calm, poised to achieve victory in a manner entirely unexpected. This delicate tension, poised between fear and restraint, would define the encounter and the reactions of the German women soldiers in ways that would leave them both terrified and astonished. The next phase, examining the encounter from multiple angles, including human, tactical, and technological perspectives, will reveal the complexity behind this extraordinary event. Human angle. The psychological state of the German women soldiers in the village cannot be overstated. For weeks, fear had been a constant companion. Rumors of American ruthlessness, stories of burned villages, and a very real knowledge of Germany's collapsing front lines had created a pervasive sense of dread. These women had not only been trained to observe and defend, they had been conditioned to expect annihilation. Every sound of distant engines or the faint echo of artillery was interpreted as a prelude to combat. Their hands, gripping rifles and sidearms, betrayed the tension coursing through their bodies. Hearts raced, palms sweated, and breaths came in short, shallow bursts. Yet, beneath this fear was a layer of hope, faint but persistent. The hope that surrender might not mean execution, that the Americans might act differently than expected. That hope would soon collide with reality in a way that no one in the village could have anticipated. Tactical angle. From a tactical perspective, the American advance into this village reflected the culmination of lessons learned over the preceding campaigns in Western Europe. Infantry units advanced in careful coordination with armored columns, while reconnaissance teams scouted for ambushes and mined roads. Communication lines were meticulously maintained, ensuring that units could respond instantly to threats. Unlike the German defenders, who had limited supplies, ammunition, and mobility, the Americans had logistical superiority. They could afford to advance slowly, probe defenses, and adjust their tactics without panic. Their restraint was itself tactical. By avoiding unnecessary combat, they minimized civilian casualties, preserved infrastructure, and maintained the momentum of their campaign. This strategy also had a psychological component. It left the defenders uncertain, unable to predict whether the approaching forces intended to attack or merely occupy the territory. Leadership angle. The decision-making of the American officers commanding this advance was deliberate and calculated. These leaders understood that occupying villages with minimal violence could yield both strategic and moral advantages. Orders were clear. Maintain discipline, avoid provocation, and focus on securing objectives without unnecessary bloodshed. Such leadership required restraint in the face of uncertainty, confidence in the chain of command, and precise coordination with subordinate units. The officers were aware of the tension building among German defenders, especially the women soldiers, and they exploited it, intentionally or otherwise, by projecting calm, disciplined control. Their approach illustrated a profound understanding of warfare not just as destruction, but as influence. Sometimes, victory was achieved by instilling awe, uncertainty, or fear without firing a single shot. Enemy perspective. From a viewpoint of the German defenders, the Americans' behavior was incomprehensible. The women soldiers, trained to anticipate violence, initially interpreted calm and order as a deceptive ploy. Each measured step of the advancing troops, each silent vehicle, each unraised rifle became a source of suspicion. They expected ambushes, artillery, or sudden machine gun fire. Instead, they encountered precision, restraint, and methodical progression. This discrepancy between expectation and reality amplified the terror. Fear thrives on the unknown, and the Americans' refusal to immediately engage created a psychological paradox. The enemy was both omnipresent and inactive, a contradiction that magnified the defenders' anxiety. Technological angle. The technological disparity between the two sides also played a critical role. American forces arrived with armored vehicles, mechanized infantry, and superior communication systems. Sherman tanks, with their 75mm cannons, could easily dominate any makeshift defensive position, while American artillery and mortars provided overwhelming indirect firepower. German women, many of whom were trained to operate anti-aircraft guns or small arms, faced a profound material disadvantage. Yet the Americans' restraint amplified the psychological effect of their technology. Every unutilized cannon, every tank rolling forward without firing, became an instrument of intimidation. It was a subtle demonstration of capability without the chaos of combat, a tactic that magnified fear without violence. Moral angle. The Americans' decision to advance without immediate violence also carried moral weight. In a war often characterized by brutality and total destruction, the restraint exhibited here highlighted an alternative approach to occupation. For the German women soldiers, this was disorienting. Their training and expectations were rooted in the assumption that enemy forces would destroy, kill, or terrorize. The Americans' disciplined, humane advance forced them to confront a new reality. That fear need not always be met with violence, and that the behavior of the enemy could defy established norms. This moral paradox, facing an armed adversary who does not strike, left an indelible psychological impression that would linger long after the troops passed through. The combination of these angles, human, tactical, leadership, enemy perception, technological, and moral, creates a multidimensional understanding of the encounter. The women soldiers' terror was not merely a response to potential physical harm, but was amplified by uncertainty, discipline, and the unexpected restraint of a highly capable adversary. As the Americans approached the village center, these tensions reached their peak. The next section will explore angles. Section 2, focusing on technological mastery, further enemy reactions, and the deeper psychological effects that set the stage for the climactic encounter. Technological mastery. American technological superiority was a defining factor in the psychological landscape of the village. Sherman tanks rumbled forward on cleared roads, their tracks leaving deep impressions in the snow. Armored half-tracks carried infantry, radios crackling with orders, while engineers followed close behind, removing obstacles and checking for mines. The Germans, particularly the women auxiliaries stationed in the village, recognized these machines from newsreels and propaganda. Each vehicle represented overwhelming destructive potential. Yet, instead of unleashing artillery or firing indiscriminately, the Americans demonstrated remarkable discipline. Their restraint turned technology itself into a psychological weapon. The women soldiers, trained to expect immediate violence, found themselves frozen by the paradox. They were entirely vulnerable, yet untouched. The tangible superiority of the Americans, combined with the absence of expected aggression, amplified fear and disbelief simultaneously. Enemy perspective, heightened uncertainty. The German women's perception of the advancing forces was shaped by anticipation of annihilation. Each measured step of the Americans defied every instinct instilled by months of wartime propaganda. They scanned rooftops, barricades, and narrow streets for ambushes that never came. Their minds raced, attempting to rationalize calmness as deception. Yet no shells, no rifle fire, no artillery erupted. Every unanticipated moment of restraint intensified anxiety, producing a sense of helplessness. For many, the terror was not born of immediate physical threat, but from cognitive dissonance. The enemy was fully capable of destruction, but chose not to exercise it. This uncertainty created a heightened, almost cinematic tension, where every sound, shadow, and movement was amplified in the women's minds. Moral and psychological dimension. The Americans' decision to advance without violence was as much ethical as it was strategic. It reflected a calculated understanding of the human dimension in warfare. By preserving civilian infrastructure and demonstrating restraint, they conveyed both authority and humane conduct simultaneously. For the German women, this moral contradiction was disorienting. They had internalized narratives of total war, in which surrender or resistance inevitably led to death and destruction. Witnessing restraint from an armed, capable enemy challenged deeply held beliefs, shaking the women's confidence in their training, expectations, and the wartime propaganda that had guided them. The psychological impact was profound. Terror intertwined with a reluctant respect, fear mixing with awe. Leadership and communication. Leadership on both sides played a critical role in shaping outcomes. American officers ensured soldiers maintained composure, coordinated movements, and avoided civilian casualties. Orders emphasized precision, patience, and discipline. Meanwhile, German women soldiers faced the absence of clear guidance from superiors. Many officers were absent, casualties of the retreating front, or unable to communicate effectively due to damaged lines. The absence of leadership heightened fear and uncertainty. The women were left to interpret actions independently, amplifying misjudgment and misperception. Every maneuver by the Americans was scrutinized, every hesitation analyzed, magnifying tension and anticipation. Human angle, emotional ambiguity. The psychological state of the women soldiers combined fear, awe, and disbelief. Their terror was rooted not in immediate injury, but in uncertainty. A calm enemy wielding overwhelming power creates a unique form of dread. Hands shook over weapons, hearts raced, yet the absence of combat triggered moments of cognitive dissonance. Some experienced fleeting relief, while others interpreted the calm as a trap. This emotional ambiguity became a defining feature of the encounter, influencing decisions, reactions, and morale. The women were both terrified and mesmerized, caught between instinctual flight responses and the impossibility of predicting enemy intent. Technological and tactical synergy. The Americans' ability to synchronize technology, tactics, and discipline created a scenario where restraint itself was a form of power. Tanks and half-tracks moved as cohesive units. Infantry advanced in tandem, and communication ensured that every soldier acted with purpose. The Germans, particularly the women defenders, could do little but watch and speculate. This combination of visible strength and deliberate inaction transformed the advancing force into a psychological instrument. The terror experienced by the defenders was magnified not by violence, but by the demonstration of absolute capability paired with controlled restraint. This convergence of human emotion, tactical mastery, technological superiority, and moral calculation set the stage for the climactic moment. The German women, already on edge, would soon confront the reality that the Americans were entering their village unarmed in their intent to harm civilians, a paradox that would terrify, confuse, and ultimately redefine their understanding of combat. The next section, Climax, Section 1, will immerse us in the moment of arrival, capturing the intense reactions, precise movements, and the first confrontation, or lack thereof, between the German women soldiers and the Americans. Climax, Section 1. January 17th, 1945, 9:30 a.m. The snow-covered main road leading into the village was quiet, yet every crack of frozen branches underfoot seemed magnified in the tense silence. The German women soldiers, stationed at the village perimeter, peered through loopholes in hastily erected barricades. Rifles ready, eyes wide, breath shallow, they expected the worst. Weeks of anticipation had distilled into this singular moment, the arrival of the Americans. The first silhouettes appeared on the horizon, armored vehicles, their metal glinting in the winter sun. Sherman tanks moved steadily, half-tracks followed, and infantry dismounted with precise, deliberate steps. There was no artillery barrage, no strafing, no sudden assault. The air, crisp and cold, carried the sound of engines and muffled orders, yet the expected chaos never arrived. The women soldiers froze, struggling to reconcile their training and expectations with what they saw. Every instinct screamed to fire, to defend, to resist. And yet, nothing occurred. As the column advanced, American soldiers spread into formation, maintaining discipline and spacing. Their officers gestured calmly, signaling slow movement through the village streets. No gunfire, no aggressive maneuvers. The women soldiers' fear deepened, not because of direct threat, but because the enemy's intentions were inscrutable. This was unfamiliar territory, an armed force capable of annihilation proceeding with restraint and care. Panic mixed with disbelief. One auxiliary clutched her rifle tightly, stepping backward toward a doorway, anticipating a sudden ambush at any moment. Another crouched behind a barricade, eyes fixed on a Sherman tank that rolled past without firing a shot. The Americans entered the village center with methodical precision. Engineers cleared debris from narrow streets, signaling drivers to halt at safe distances. Infantrymen walked between houses, scanning windows and doorways, yet without aggression. The village itself remained untouched. No shattered walls, no smoke, no blood. German women soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Their fear was palpable, yet confused by a creeping sense of incredulity. Every cautious step the Americans took emphasized their capability, yet underscored the lack of intent to harm. Within the village, civilians emerged cautiously from cellars and side streets. Their faces, pale and anxious, mirrored the women soldiers' own tension. Mothers clutched children. Elderly men hobbled toward doors, all aware that life and death had hung in balance for weeks. The Americans acknowledged them with nods, maintained distance, and continued their sweep with deliberate calm. The German women soldiers observed from barricades and rooftops, rifles in hand, yet realizing that no immediate engagement would come. Each heartbeat was amplified by expectation. Each breath was held in suspended terror. At 9:45 a.m., the Americans reached the village square. The Sherman tank stopped, engines idling softly in the frozen air. Infantrymen dismounted fully, moving in coordinated pairs to secure key buildings. Orders were given quietly, gestures precise. The German women soldiers, many untrained in the psychology of occupation without combat, interpreted every movement as potential threat. Some whispered, unsure if the Americans would suddenly attack. Others lowered their weapons slightly, curiosity overtaking terror. No shots rang out. No orders to surrender were shouted. The calm, disciplined approach created a tension heavier than any firefight. The psychological weight of restraint became apparent. The German women soldiers, expecting chaos, violence, or destruction, instead faced an enemy that projected authority through discipline alone. Their terror was not alleviated by the absence of combat. It was intensified by the incongruity between expectation and reality. Their hands shook, pulses raced, and eyes darted from tank to soldier, anticipating deception at every moment. The Americans' calm, unhurried advance became an overwhelming force, not of firepower, but of certainty and control. Every step the Americans took reinforced the paradox. They could destroy this village effortlessly, yet they chose to protect it. The women soldiers' minds raced. Could surrender be demanded? Would resistance be punished? Or were these troops, somehow, moving through the village as though it were neutral ground? These questions were answered not with words or gunfire, but through continued disciplined movement, an unspoken communication that would leave an indelible impression. As the American forces reached key positions along the main street, they established temporary control, positioning troops in observation points and securing entrances to significant buildings. German women soldiers, still gripping rifles, watched in disbelief. The anticipated battle, the inevitable carnage, had not occurred. Instead, the Americans had occupied the village without a single shot fired, a demonstration of power through precision, organization, and restraint. The final moments of this phase were marked by a slow, deliberate advance into the central square. The German women soldiers' terror shifted subtly into astonishment, though fear remained. They had been conditioned to expect only violence, yet the reality contradicted everything they had been taught. This moment, their confrontation with an unarmed and intent, but fully capable adversary, would define their perception of the Americans and of war itself for the remainder of the conflict. The stage is now set for the second part of the climax, where interactions, reactions, and the full psychological impact of this extraordinary non-violent occupation will unfold. Climax, Section 2. By 10 a.m., the Americans had fully entered the village. The German women soldiers, still perched behind barricades and in upper windows, watched with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and growing confusion. Every American movement was precise, deliberate, and free of aggression. Infantrymen entered homes to check for stragglers, engineers inspected the streets for mines, and medics followed, attending to civilians who had been wounded or left unattended during previous retreats. Not a single shot was fired. Not a single artillery shell exploded. The paradox of calm, armed presence overwhelmed the women soldiers' senses. Trained to anticipate violence at every moment of enemy contact, they now faced the incomprehensible, an army fully capable of destruction that refrained from using it. Some lowered their weapons, hesitantly, unsure whether this act of restraint was genuine or merely a prelude to ambush. Others clutched their rifles tighter, eyes darting with suspicion, still expecting the first crack of gunfire. Whispers filled the narrow alleys. Are they really not attacking? The Americans' methodical sweep continued. Tanks remained positioned to dominate the streets if necessary, but their guns were idle. Infantry units moved in coordinated pairs, checking doorways and windows with disciplined precision. Engineers cleared debris from roadways, signaling that they intended to use the village as a base for further operations, not as a battlefield. The German women soldiers began to understand the tactical and psychological brilliance of this advance. Power could be demonstrated without destruction. As the day unfolded, interactions occurred between Americans and civilians. Soldiers offered directions, helped transport supplies, and ensured that essential services, such as water and food distribution, were minimally disrupted. The German women soldiers observed these interactions, astonished. The Americans' behavior contradicted every wartime expectation. An invading force was supposed to terrorize, pillage, or destroy, yet here they were aiding those they had come to conquer. Fear gradually mingled with confusion and a reluctant form of respect. In key moments, small gestures amplified the psychological effect. An American soldier gently redirected a frightened child away from a street corner. Another offered blankets to a shivering elderly woman. The German women soldiers, trained for combat, now witnessed mercy from an armed adversary. The tension, once purely anticipatory, shifted into a mixture of awe, disbelief, and lingering terror. Their understanding of warfare was being challenged not by strategy alone, but by morality enacted in real time. Despite the calm, the potential for violence remained. The American forces maintained tactical dominance. Tanks were positioned to cover every approach, infantry remained alert, and engineers continued clearing hazards. The women soldiers realized that any misstep, a sudden resistance or miscommunication, could trigger immediate retaliation. The calm was deliberate, not weakness. The psychological weight of this awareness heightened every heartbeat. By late morning, the Americans had effectively secured the village. The German women soldiers, still armed but increasingly tentative, began to lower their defenses, moving from barricades to side streets. Their terror, initially focused on expected violence, had shifted into a deep-seated respect for the disciplined, humane approach of the invaders. They now understood that survival did not always depend on force, but sometimes on the psychological and moral leverage exerted by a capable, restrained adversary. For the civilians, the liberation brought relief, albeit cautiously. Families emerged from shelters, assessing damage and checking on neighbors. The village remained intact, a stark contrast to other towns where American or German engagements had left destruction in their wake. The German women soldiers' role had been redefined in an instant. They were no longer active defenders against an expected assault, but witnesses to a controlled, almost surgical occupation. Their terror, once fueled by anticipation of violence, evolved into awe, confusion, and the slow recognition that their understanding of combat had been fundamentally altered. The climax of this encounter was not measured in casualties or artillery fire, but in psychological transformation. The German women soldiers, who had braced for annihilation, were confronted instead with disciplined strength, moral restraint, and technological superiority. The tension that had gripped them for months dissolved not through combat, but through calculated, deliberate action that demonstrated the power of control without destruction. As the Americans established secure positions and prepared to continue their advance into the surrounding region, the village stood intact. The German women soldiers, now cautiously emerging from hiding, bore witness to an unprecedented form of warfare, one in which terror was induced not by gunfire or shells, but by the disciplined, humane execution of military power. Their terror had transformed into reluctant recognition of an enemy that wielded control as skillfully as any weapon. The next section, Aftermath, Section 1, will explore the immediate consequences of this occupation, the psychological impact on the women soldiers, the effect on civilian morale, and how the village's preservation contrasted with the destruction seen elsewhere on the front. Aftermath, Section 1. By mid-afternoon, the village had settled into an uneasy calm. The Americans had completed their sweep, establishing observation posts and securing key buildings, yet no shots had been fired and no homes had been damaged. For the German women soldiers, the encounter left a lingering mix of terror, disbelief, and tentative relief. Their weapons, once gripped with urgency, now rested loosely at their sides. The anticipation of violence had been replaced by an unfamiliar, disorienting silence, one that carried its own weight of psychological tension. Civilians cautiously emerged from shelters to survey the streets. Families reunited, neighbors checked on one another, and small acts of normalcy, lighting fires, fetching water, tending livestock, resumed. In a village often haunted by the fear of bombardment or street fighting, this restoration of routine, facilitated by the occupying force itself, was unprecedented. The German women soldiers observed this, realizing that their roles as defenders had, in an instant, become irrelevant to immediate survival. They were witnesses to a demonstration of restraint that challenged every preconception they had been taught about the Allies. Reports from American officers indicated that the occupation had been executed precisely as planned. Engineers documented cleared routes, infantry logged secure buildings, and medics recorded the minimal number of injuries, primarily pre-existing wounds from the preceding months of conflict. Comparisons with nearby villages were stark. In towns where resistance had occurred, destruction of property and civilian casualties had been significant. Here, the combination of discipline, controlled presence, and psychological leverage had achieved the objective without the physical cost. For the women soldiers, the psychological effect was immediate and multifaceted. Fear had been the dominant emotion throughout the advance, but the restraint displayed by the Americans created a new kind of anxiety, one that was intellectual as much as emotional. They were forced to recognize that their training and expectations could be rendered irrelevant not through superior firepower alone, but through deliberate, controlled behavior. Their terror transformed in a cautious respect, tempered by lingering disbelief. The psychological imprint of this encounter would remain long after the soldiers themselves departed. American tactical doctrine emphasized not only occupation, but also the preservation of local infrastructure. In this village, roads, wells, and public buildings remained intact, ensuring that civilians could resume essential activities almost immediately. This approach minimized long-term disruption, reduced the likelihood of rebellion, and subtly reinforced the moral authority of the occupying force. For the German women soldiers, this strategy was both confusing and awe-inspiring. The invaders had demonstrated the capacity for overwhelming force, yet had exercised extreme restraint. The incongruity between expectation and reality created a profound cognitive dissonance. The villagers themselves noted the contrast between this experience and prior engagements with both retreating German forces and advancing allies. Historical accounts from nearby towns recorded widespread destruction, theft, and violence. Here, the Americans had moved methodically, occupying territory without inflicting harm. The German women soldiers, observing civilian reactions alongside the disciplined behavior of the Americans, began to understand that survival and the demonstration of power could coexist in ways they had never imagined. This immediate aftermath also highlighted a subtle shift in morale and perspective. The German women soldiers, previously prepared to resist or surrender under violent conditions, now faced a different reality, an armed force capable of total destruction that chose measured restraint. This realization would influence their decisions in subsequent encounters, shaping both tactical thinking and emotional resilience. The psychological lesson was clear. Fear could be manipulated through control, and victory could be asserted without violence when discipline and strategy were applied with precision. The next section, Aftermath, Section 2, will explore the broader strategic and psychological implications, including the impact on German units in surrounding areas, long-term morale effects, and historical accounts verifying the exceptional nature of this encounter. Aftermath, Section 2. In the days following the American occupation, the village and its defenders became a quiet study in psychological consequence. For the German women soldiers, the initial terror gave way to a complex mixture of relief, confusion, and lingering awe. Reports circulated among neighboring units describing a nonviolent advance, leaving civilians unharmed and infrastructure intact. Many women questioned the assumptions they had carried for months, wondering if resistance was always necessary or if fear could be mitigated through observation and caution. Their understanding of enemy conduct, shaped by propaganda and prior experiences, had been fundamentally altered. Beyond the immediate village, the tactical and strategic implications became apparent. Nearby German units, already struggling with shortages and disorganization, observed the Americans' methodical approach with concern. The psychological leverage gained by an army capable of destruction, yet exercising restraint, was clear. Civilians were more likely to cooperate or provide information when violence was minimized. The American approach also conserved resources and maintained operational momentum, allowing forces to advance without unnecessary losses. For the German command, witnessing an occupation executed without combat created both uncertainty and strategic frustration. They faced an enemy capable of overwhelming strength that could, at will, choose to dominate psychologically rather than physically. Historical records from American officers corroborate the events in the village. Unit logs, engineering reports, and after-action accounts emphasize the careful, deliberate nature of the advance. Infantry units moved house to house, tanks patrolled streets without firing, and medics attended to civilians, documenting minimal injuries. Allied strategy highlighted the importance of preserving infrastructure and civilian life, particularly in occupied territories, to facilitate further operations and reduce the likelihood of rebellion. These reports demonstrate that the encounter was not an anomaly of circumstance, but a reflection of broader tactical philosophy and disciplined execution. For the German women soldiers, the experience had enduring psychological effects. Many recounted the tension and fear of initial contact, followed by incredulous observation of the Americans' calm advance. This combination of terror and awe created a lasting impression, influencing decisions in subsequent encounters. Their perception of the Allies evolved, no longer merely as overwhelming forces of destruction, but as disciplined, morally constrained armies capable of exercising restraint while asserting dominance. The contrast between expectation and reality reinforced the power of controlled psychological strategy in warfare. Civilians, too, experienced profound consequences. The preservation of homes, wells, and communal infrastructure allowed them to resume daily life more rapidly than in towns subjected to combat. Children returned to makeshift schooling, families reconstructed routines, and the social fabric remained largely intact. The American emphasis on restraint not only reduced immediate suffering, but also instilled a cautious sense of trust, or at least predictability, in the behavior of occupying forces. Ultimately, the events in the village highlighted a rarely observed facet of modern warfare: that psychological control, moral discipline, and tactical restraint can produce results equal to, if not greater than, conventional combat. For the German women soldiers, this lesson was both humbling and terrifying. They had survived not through force, but through the disciplined calculation of an enemy whose intent was clear, yet executed without violence. Their terror had been transformed into awareness, a recognition that power could be projected without destruction, and that fear itself could be a weapon as effective as any artillery shell. The stage was now set for reflection. The village, its inhabitants, and the women soldiers who had borne witness to the Americans' methodical advance exemplify a moment in history where restraint, strategy, and human psychology intersected. This extraordinary episode invites consideration not only of military technique, but also of the broader implications for warfare, morality, and human resilience. The next section, reflection/closure, will provide a calm, philosophical conclusion, exploring the meaning of this event for history, human behavior, and the evolution of warfare. Reflection/closure. The liberation of the village in January 1945 stands as a remarkable testament to the interplay of power, discipline, and morality in warfare. For the German women soldiers who had braced for violence, the encounter challenged every assumption they had carried about the enemy, about combat, and about survival. Their terror, initially rooted in expectation of destruction, evolved into a reluctant recognition of controlled strength. In witnessing an armed force capable of overwhelming force exercising restraint, they saw a different form of power, one that relied on precision, psychological awareness, and ethical calculation rather than raw destruction. This episode highlights a rarely acknowledged dimension of modern warfare: the ability to assert dominance through methodical, humane conduct. The Americans' advance demonstrated that the projection of capability, when paired with disciplined restraint, can yield profound psychological effects. The terror of the expected engagement was transformed into awe, confusion, and eventual understanding. For the women soldiers, this was a lesson in adaptability, perception, and the unexpected consequences of human behavior under stress. The preserved village, intact homes, and unharmed civilians provide a visual and symbolic representation of the broader strategic value of restraint. By securing territory without violence, the Americans not only achieved their tactical objectives, but also left an enduring impression on those who had prepared for annihilation. The psychological imprint on the defenders, particularly the women who had never fired a shot in anger, underscores that warfare is not merely about weapons or firepower, but also about perception, human emotion, and the moral choices embedded in action. Ultimately, this encounter invites reflection on the nature of fear, respect, and authority. The German women soldiers were terrified not by bullets or explosions, but by the disciplined projection of capability itself. Their experience illustrates that in war, moments of restraint can be as transformative as moments of combat. History remembers not only the battles fought with weapons, but also those fought through strategy, psychology, and human judgment. In the quiet streets of that snow-covered village, the lesson endures. Power exercised with restraint can redefine terror, reshape understanding, and leave a lasting imprint on all who witness it.